Hi, I'm Michael Joy. Welcome to another reaction video. I want to say up front here, if you're a subscriber or catching this video randomly, just know that this is a mold making video. We make a lot of content here and I'm a professional mold maker, and so you may or may not want to be on this bus if you're interested in some other things. But for the makers out there, get ready. Hi, I'm Michael Joy. Welcome to another mold making video here at Shapeshifters TV. We run several lines of content. This mold making video is going to fall under our Hand-ufacturing. Stay tuned for some upcoming videos where we're not just going to be critiquing the molds, we're going to be making some molds. But the critiquing is really useful because I'm not just going to say things to bash people. I'm going to say things that maybe elevate some of the content that we see. At least that's my hope. If you see me criticizing heavily on somebody who's not doing a great job, I haven't figured out how to do the workaround around that. I'm trying not to make this personal, just about the technique, but sometimes something's being done really wrong. I'll really only call it out if it seems to be a health hazard or something like that. But let's get into it. We'll continue with the plaster mold making, which is a specialty of mine years ago. Let's see. Oh, public health requirements. This is quite a good little disclaimer. Can I fast forward through this? He says plaster mold making 101.
Or it could potentially cause the object to get stuck inside the plaster when it's hardened.
Okay.
So you're going to use oil clay to fill those voids or those cracks or those details, because oil clay...
So what happens is on the weekends, I kind of sit on the couch when I'm chilling and I go through some random mold making videos on YouTube. If you guys want to spare me some weekend time and you have a mold maker that you see doing something interesting or kind of not understandable on the internet, shoot me the link to it and we'll consider making a reaction video to it, a critique. Maybe we can make it better. This guy is going to make a mold of a light bulb. I'll probably stop him a few times, but let's see.
Unlike water clay, won't shrink over time, it won't crack.
This is really loud. I'm going to turn it down.
Time and detail, and not worry about that changing when you walk away.
Okay. I'm not going to really bother about the undercut thing he's talking about. He explained it if you watch his video.
Next, identify your seam lines. Oftentimes the objects you're going to use are made in a factory, and so they already have existing seam lines that can act as your map that you can follow to make your mold. Here, the light bulb.
Oh, okay. So right off the top there, the light bulb, manufactured items have seam lines, but oftentimes the pieces of the item were manufactured separately and then assembled. So some of the seam lines can't be trusted for pottery plaster molds. In this instance, he just drew a blue line across the front of the glass, which is not something I would have done. I would have made a two-piece mold, two of the threaded rod section, sort of the cone, and then I would have made a bottom piece fall off of the lens of the light bulb at the bottom. The reason is in ceramic, detailed seam lines are hard to clean up, and I would never put a seam line, if at all possible, across a detailed object from the front of the actual piece. Now, depending on how he was going to display this in a sculpture, the lens might have been the right place to put a seam line, but in general, it's like putting a seam line right across the middle of a face. Don't do it if you can avoid it.
The bulb doesn't have those, so I've used a permanent marker to divide it in half. We're next going to use water clay to bury half of the object. Essentially, we want to bury one half so that the other half is exposed and can be completely covered with plaster. And that's how we'll make our first half. Use a ruler to measure the height of your seam line.
That's good.
So that it is level.
I would just say, if you notice the height of his work table is crotch level. For the camera, it's not helpful. And also, if you have at all the choice to work higher on a table, do. If your table's low and it's fixed and that's just the way your studio is, throw a milk crate under there, but there's no reason to have to squat down or things like that.
Next, you can be...
It's really important what he's doing, but not just this way, it's got to be this way level also.
Don't worry about being too detailed right now, because you'll go back, as you can see here, with different tools to sharpen that up and get right to your seam line.
When you're fast, this should take about 40 minutes to make a parting line. What happens is a lot of people overbuild the parting line and they spend a lot of time putting clay down that they're going to cut off.
Mark measurements that will identify the width.
About an inch?
You don't want to make your mold too thin because
It's good.
will either break easily.
Whoa, okay, so I wouldn't make a round mold around this because then you gotta have a wonky mold box or flashing and there's troubles with flashing. I would have squared that off. Plaster's cheap, just use it.
But more importantly, it won't be able to absorb water from the clay as it's intended to. You can
Messy.
see where I made that line, I have a lot of extra clay on the outside. That's intentional. I can always cut it away later. It's really difficult to add it on. Here I'm using
He's not wrong.
a screwdriver to create a key, something we'll talk about later.
That's
So adding this little coil on
a pouring gate.
is so that if you want to use your mold for slip casting, it acts as the opening to pour the slip or liquid clay in
Okay.
to your mold.
If you've watched the mold videos before, the French guy would carve this in afterwards.
Make two shapes of mold.
Okay, so those are foundry gloves. You really shouldn't have to wear foundry gloves when making a plaster mold. I think that the aluminum flashing is really sharp, and this is why I don't use it for the full cases, the full mold boxes. It adjusts too much, the aluminum is expensive, why waste it? And you don't get good, consistent results with it.
The first one I'm going to demo is cylindrical. So I'm using
Don't do it.
flashing. This can very easily be changed to different diameters or
It warps, it kinks.
that you have overlaps. So you wouldn't want just a single circle of flashing. You actually want it to go around a couple times. Once you have the correct size or length, you can use it.
Looks like a hassle, doesn't it?
Gently press down into the clay where it'll hold its shape.
Those blow open too. From the bottom, they'll bleed.
Here I'm identifying the fill line.
Pouring indication line,
Have a fill line because so easily you can over pour your plaster.
an inch.
Your mold much too thick, much too thin.
Good, that's good.
So have a line inside where you know when and where to stop.
He's gonna have registration problems. To me, it's not consistent enough. It's gonna work. Remember, ceramicists are more interested in what comes out of the mold than the mold itself.
We have acquired a far superior material that will replace the metal flashing.
Oh,
It's much easier to reuse.
I didn't think about that a teacher is working with the restrictions of whatever environment they're in.
It's much safer to use and to create cylindrical molds
Wait.
with. Next, we're going to show how to make
Okay,
rectangular.
I have to get the question off my face of why they did that.
Unlike the cylindrical, I'm starting with actually cutting off.
If you have a lot of clay to cut off, what happens is you cut it off and you end up pulling away the clay from the dividing wall and you have to go back and retouch it. I would cut in slices with something sharp, and you've got to make sure that the verticality of the cut wall stays there for your mold box. It's a lot of extra work.
Once I have identified my
Your whole mold wall gets pulled down with that slicing motion. There it goes, that's good. Knife, nice.
of the clay you're using
The clay walls are now like this,
is malleable.
which I don't like.
Change shape.
Where does mold keys go?
These are called coddle boards.
Yeah.
You will need 4.
So if you're using particle board for your mold boards, you have to seal these edges because particle board is extremely porous. It's going to take water from the plaster and swell up, and then you're just going to be left with kind of a crap, warped, weathered piece.
Every time you make a rectangular mold,
You got to seal them up on the edges.
demonstrating how to set them up. They're very simple, but can be confusing if you've never used them before. You can see they're kind of an L shape. We have the bottom part of the
This is how we do it in the shop, except we use metal, and it's the fastest way to make a mold box by far. The nice thing is the wood ones a lot of people can make. The metal ones are hard for people to make.
L always facing out, and we're following the bottom of the L around until we meet up.
All the L's should be pointing outside of the mold box. That's how you remember it. It's like a windmill. L's short pieces point out.
Easily I can change shape or size.
We get it?
Gently pressing them on and using hand clamps. I'm only putting on 3 and not the
That's good.
4th because it allows
You need to
easily get
torque it down with the third board.
and to make small coils
See?
to fill.
I think if you cut your clay wall really nice, you don't have to do this coil method. You should just be able to take a tool and just swipe in a line there. This is unnecessary. Once you get your hands in the mold box, it starts messing with things. I don't like to put my hands inside the mold box once I've built the box. It just makes things go crazy.
Seams where the clay meets the cottle board. This is very important. If you don't do this, you could potentially have what we call a plaster disaster. The plaster will leak through that seam and go all over.
But you can just smear it down. You don't need a coil.
Again.
Here we go.
You also want to make sure to do the corners of the mold. If
you have nicely cut mold boards, you don't have to do the corners, but I like his preparedness because you can ruin those boards through the moisture on the corners like I mentioned earlier.
Does not need to be very thick, but make sure you run your finger up.
So when I clamp my clamps on the mold boards, I always tip my clamps out rather than vertical. And the reason is when I go to pour a bucket of plaster into it, I have to hold my plaster above the clamps, versus if they're laid flat a little bit, I can get my bucket closer to the pour. You'll see when he does this.
And down so that it's filling that seam.
Easy to do, worth it, but not necessary. Some people will screw their mold boxes together. Don't do it.
Oils or soaps. Basically, these allow you to...
You don't use Vaseline with slip casting molds, plaster molds for that, because it seals the pores. And the Murphy's oil soap is okay, but they do sell what's called a Potter soap. It's a neutral potash. I don't remember what that means after 20 years, but it's a nice clean soap that dissolves easily with water. Murphy's oil is a little heavy. You might need to dilute it. I would just use like a Dawn dishwashing soap that's been diluted if you can't get a pottery soap.
Take your object out of the plaster mold after you have created it.
I would have used a brush.
This can, in the end, cause your object to lock into place and cause you a lot of frustration.
But he's doing good.
The ventilation system is absolutely essential.
I like this. Nice.
Plaster room.
So if you don't have ventilation, what you do is you take a box fan. We have one right over here. It's a $15 box fan, 20 by 20, and you put a air conditioning filter, a 1-inch filter, right behind the intake of the fan, meaning the side that it draws through. And you can put that on a chair right next to your mixing plaster, and at least picks up the particulates and keeps them out of your face. And if you don't put the fan on high, it won't blow it around the shop. So this is good.
Specifically when you're using the plaster in a powder form. Here I just refilled our container, and now I'm getting ready to...
I would have just kept it in the bag.
How much plaster do I need? How much water do I need? All measurements should be in milliliters and grams. First, start by calculating both the volume of the space of your mold.
We should order dinner.
For rectangles, you use...
I'm going to fast forward through this. Here's why. All of this length times width times heights times volume times cubics times you need to be an Egyptian pyramid builder to figure out the volume of this. Some people it comes really easy, other people it doesn't. I would say in a mold this size, just don't mix less than half a gallon of water. And it looks like he's gonna, for the box size that he made, is I would have mixed up about 8 pounds of plaster, which is 3/4 of a gallon of water. I just see it by eye. After you do it for a while, you will too. The thing is to not waste plaster, is just have another mold box ready to set up. Contrary to a lot of people's comments, you can join layers of plaster. It's not the best, but you can, if you run short, you can add more plaster. So I'm gonna try to fast forward through this math here. Even though it's nicely presented, if you want it, watch his video. Okay, always water first.
And now,
his scale should be in a bag.
Based on my calculations. Notice I'm slowly doing this. This is important.
Where's his ventilation?
Plaster to slowly mix with...
He's right about that. Put it in slow. Oh, I got this damn thing.
Slake in the water.
Sorry, guys.
4 minutes. This is a good time to check everything else. Make sure you have
let the plaster soak.
Your tools ready. You'll use the corded drill to mix the plaster for 3 to 3.5 minutes.
In the ceramic studio, dust and dirt is normal, so it's very easy to get used to being dirty all the time. But if you think about it, there's things you can do to kind of minimize that. So what's going to happen is he's going to mix with the drill, which I can comment on in a moment. But when he takes that drill out, it's going to splash and go all around. And so I used to have these plaster rings on my jeans from splashing. So what I started doing was, you saw that big plaster tote that he had for his dry plaster. I would always put my mixing bucket inside of a plaster tote so that the mixing and the splashing hit the tote, not me. It's another thing to stay clean.
Mixing too long can cause problems.
You should not have a propeller.
Not long enough can also cause problems.
I wouldn't mix for 3 minutes is about right.
You're going to do 6 to 7 minutes.
He's right.
It's energy going into the plaster, so it takes a little bit longer of mixing to get the same.
If you use warm water, it's going to speed up the setting of the plaster. I always just use warm water.
Here I've brought the plaster over to where I'll be pouring.
Okay. He's back to the aluminum. What happened?
Basically vibrating the bucket so that air bubbles will flow.
That doesn't matter.
And when they do come to the surface, I'll use rubbing alcohol to give it a little spritz, and it'll break the tension.
Those bubbles don't matter. You don't need that step. It's when you pour it into it, if it splashes, that's when you're making bubbles.
In. You want it to pour in slowly.
He's good. It's good.
Work its way over the object.
Because he has high detail, I would have taken a brush and I would have brushed over the threaded portion of the light bulb and over some of the things here, but he'll be okay. It's going to stick in there, but he'll be okay.
Covering all the details and forcing any air out.
Where's his indication line?
Stop at your fill line.
Okay. This is the other way. Use your finger, 1 inch.
Point to check and make sure you're...
So he just made 2 hands dirty. He had 1 finger, just use the same hand.
Surface tension while the plaster is wet. Basically, this will make the top nice and flat.
A good mold table actually shakes. So if you make a mold table that's too stiff, you can't ever jog the table. You have to jog the workboard or things like this. My table's always wobbled a little bit by design.
And make sure that it's filling all the corners.
He poured it a little too soon.
After you've poured, dispose of any extra plaster into an old box.
All right, so what he's saying here is really important. A lot of ceramicists use plaster slab work for wedging clay. So if you take a box, a cardboard box, and you cut it to a depth of maybe 3 inches, anytime you have leftover plaster, which is money in the sense of your time carrying it into the shop, it's heavy, you just pour off the extra plaster into the box and you'll eventually have enough that has a nice slab. But you should never, ever dump wet plaster or rinse a wet plaster bucket in a sink. Let's see how he does.
Any type of trash, put it in the trash can, get rid of it, and use the rinse water in the rinse bucket to clean your bucket.
Okay, so I disagree with this. What I would do is I would have enough buckets in my shop to not have to rely on one. And what would happen is I would deliberately leave about a ½ inch of wet plaster in the bucket. And as it began to set up, I would take that bucket and I would roll it like a cement truck so the plaster coated the side walls of the bucket. And then I'd put that bucket aside and then I'd let it set. The benefit of that is there's none of this rinsing, the plaster sets, and then you just crack it, and then this hard-boiled eggshell of plaster falls out into the trash, and then you knock it. If you use a drill that has a sharp blade on it for mixing plaster, your bucket's gonna get all chewed up on the inside, and gradually that's gonna create this Velcro texture effect that wants to hold plaster to your bucket, and they get harder and harder to clean. So I use a mixing disc. It doesn't cut into the bucket, and I don't do this much rinsing. The sink's low, his back is bending, all these things as a professional mold maker, they've made sense. I was sort of leaning weird for an hour a day, times all week. These motions mattered to me.
Clean your tools and then take it to the sink and give it a second rinse.
His plaster is being poured too late.
Too long. Plaster was mixed, you can see how chunky it is.
Yeah. Wrap your work.
It's being poured, wrap your work, and we're wrapping this not so much for the plaster, but the clay that's underneath.
Yeah.
If we don't wrap it, that clay will become dry and be rendered unusable again. We'd have to recycle it, and it's just a very long, arduous process. So,
Cottles. Oh, I didn't know that's how you spell it.
and you can begin taking the cottles off.
So you can see if his tape had dropped down into the level of the plaster that he had poured, it would have been a little tricky to get that off, but here he goes. He's doing 2 molds at the same time. He's going between the designs.
You do need to be very careful. Those edges can be sharp.
That flashing is expensive and it bends out and becomes useless very fast.
The clay below, you can just start peeling off and put back into the bucket as long as it's not too dry.
You can only put your mold making clay in a mold making clay bucket.
Or that loop
Don't mix them.
carving tool. Both work well.
It's good that he has a trash can right next to the workbench.
Make it nice.
I would have used a Sureform to go around that edge.
Over to make the second piece. So you want to make sure that that surface is flat. It's not going to be rocking the whole time you're working.
What's happening?
I'm pulling a wire.
So something I forgot to mention is at the beginning, I would always put a piece of wax paper between wet clay and my workboard, just because now, even though he uses the wire to take the clay off of the workboard, now he has to scrape it. It's another dang thing to do. You can imagine if you have 20 shortcuts, you've just saved yourself an hour. And an hour matters if you're not on the clock, you're paying yourself. So this is fine, but there's a better way.
Tool carefully through so that the clay will separate from that bottom board.
2 people? No.
And now with that clay,
See, they just take it out of frame.
you'll see taking it to the rinse bucket or to some type of water, dipping it in and putting it back into the bucket I took it from.
Yeah, that's fair, fair idea.
The clay has dried significantly. Well,
What happens is if you start mixing a clay rinse with your hands and plaster, it gets moldy and gunky if you're keeping one mixed bucket, and you can get skin irritation. So I don't rinse clay and plaster in the same bucket. I would have a messy rinse bucket for my wash off, and then I'd wash off my hands in the sink with fresh water. Otherwise, you've just kind of kept your hands messy. I would say, you hear me say a lot of things about fussiness with hand cleaning, but some people already know I wear contact lenses. I don't have a choice. I have 2 contact lenses in each one of my eyes. So you'll often see me doing this because I'm correcting the lenses in my eye. But you can imagine why I don't want to have dirty hands. Just by reflex, I'm always fixing one of my contact lenses. And other contact lens wearers out there, you know, you really got to pay attention to what's going near your eyes.
clay is too dry, it makes it really difficult for the next person that wants to make a mold. Using that same loop tool.
I never liked the loop tools. They're weak and the metal pulls out of the handle.
That top part.
Use whatever you're comfortable with.
Careful to identify the seam.
So if he had made a really nice clay dividing wall, he wouldn't have to be shaving right here. You just milk that out and you're good. 1 mold key, he should have had at least 2.
Line. You can use a ruler like this, some type of small
I got a lot of those. Those are handy.
degree corner to get a very
Yeah,
clean seam between your object and the
they're
mold.
great. Harbor Freight, high five.
Sandpaper works well.
No, it doesn't. Sandpaper fills up with plaster. You need to have wet, dry sandpaper. And I would just say, remember, if you did your mold wall nice at the beginning, you'd only have to be doing touch-ups.
Here I'm cleaning up the key that I talked about with the screwdriver. I'm also cleaning up that little channel.
Yeah, it's a lot of extra work.
Now going back with water to wipe away all the crumbs and excess clay.
He made it look great, but it's just extra work. I still don't think it's going to release well.
I'm using this loop tool to make another type of key. I actually prefer making my keys this way. A key is basically the fingerprint of the mold that makes it unique and makes it so it only fits together a certain way. These are registrations. So when it's time to use the mold, it will always lock back.
I don't like those keys. The shallow groove keys that are long, I call them canoe keys, they slide. You have to have them going in different directions, but it's his choice.
Back into place the exact same way. So you saw me.
It's a lot of work to dig those out.
Driver when the clay was soft.
French guy used that drill. Boom, he was done.
After I poured the first mold. Both ways work. Next, you want to use Murphy's oil to soap your mold.
I don't like that.
You should do this multiple times to make sure that...
You don't have to soap the light bulb that many times. It's going to build up a film. You need to soap the plaster, the top and the side walls.
After you pour the second piece, or any additional part of the mold, that they will separate.
And your mold board, even though it's laminated.
The second half of the channel, so building back in that clay. Once I do this, I'm now ready to start putting on the metal flashing again to create.
I'm surprised that more teachers don't make a video of mold making, because they could save so much time if they just have the basics and they have a mold making class. They'd just be like, yeah, watch this tonight, come in, I'm going to give a demo, and then that demo can be boom, it can be fast. And these videos, the basics shouldn't have to be taught again and again and again. One and done.
Create another coddle.
Yeah, see, he's got to clean that metal. It's tedious. They sped it up. That was 3 minutes.
Get it as tight as you can. Again, we want to avoid
Oh my God.
disasters. So
Use a strap,
make sure
not
those seams.
a belt buckle. So what happens is some people see something from old mold makers who didn't have any resources, and then they do this stuff in the beginning. Why would you tie a hose like that if you got nothing else? You buy a clamp, a mold strap for $1.50 from National Art Craft, and they'll last you a lifetime. This is a hassle. You don't get even pressure.
To again, make your pour line. Have a place to stop.
Use an oil pencil rather than a Sharpie. I use them both, but the Sharpies get expensive because the tips get gunked up.
Notice this time that line is much closer to the top of my coddle.
What was that? I don't know why he did that.
Again, the coils don't need to be very thick to be effective.
Okay.
It's quite often people make very
This is extra work again. He's putting the clay on the inside, and if he had used a mold box rather than the flashing, which moves, he wouldn't have this issue. Also, the pressure of the inner tube or whatever he tied around it is not tight enough, and so he's having to put a coil in there, in my opinion.
very thick coils, much larger than needed. It's really just essential that it fills that seam like a nice bead of caulk.
See, all this working inside the mold box is like a ship in a bottle.
Murphy's oil a second time. Again,
You gotta bend over, you gotta look, you're all wonky. You need chopsticks, you know, it's not good.
so that they will release later.
He shouldn't have to soap this again. He did that already. It's fussy now. He's just wasting time.
You're simply going to repeat that
Egyptian math.
volume, measure your water,
Let's see what he did.
gravity.
Okay,
Simply allowing
so he poured it. We saw that. It's nice, he got that out.
floor eventually.
Whenever you're molding a rigid object, you have to let the plaster heat up and then cool down before it can be easily extracted. If you have a rigid model that's stuck into your plaster mold, just put it in a tub of water and sort of rock it out and help that water will help break the vacuum between the object and the plaster mold.
Pops open. Another way to separate would be to use the compressed air
Yeah.
to give little spurts that will
It's not as easy as you think.
pop open. The third way,
I found it much easier to take the mold, turn it on its side, split it with a little mud knife and drip some water in between it, and then break it that way. The water acted as a nice separator. When you try to shoot air into a mold, it doesn't go where you want it. It just kind of goes, it doesn't get in the mold. So it's not a successful way to do it.
would be to use a rubber mallet.
Yeah.
Obviously, we want to avoid banging on the mold as much as possible, but sometimes we need those extra vibrations to help
Yeah, it doesn't work like this, guys. This is camera only.
from the mold by simply pulling at it.
You gotta be real careful here. He's working with a glass object. Anytime you exert force on a glass object, it can break and you can really damage your hands. So either commit to smashing this and work safely, or know that it can break at any moment.
And if it doesn't come out easy, use a little compressed air to spray it and pop it out.
I never used
The
this.
object's out, you'll want to use a mix of
If I had a real dirty mold, I would just soak it in water for 20 minutes. It's not going to deteriorate the plaster, and then it's just soft and you just rinse it off in the bucket. The vinegar is used to dissolve the Murphy's oil clay, which I suggested that he not use in the first place. If he had used the neutral potash pottery soap, it would have just washed off with water or a little soaking. So you can see that 1 step forward, 2 steps back can cost you, it doubles the time it takes you to make a mold.
50-50 white vinegar and water.
It's
This
just,
will allow you to wash
he's not wrong, it's just slow.
release agents so that the capillary action of the plaster is doing what it's supposed to do. After you've washed it,
Use a sure form. You'll have more control than this little tool. This is for refining.
The loop tool will allow you to do this. But essentially you're going to want to do all...
Why'd he clean his board off when he's just gonna mess it up again? These are all little steps.
Don't have pieces of your mold chipping off.
He has this round mold, and now he's very limited on how he can strap that mold. He has to go across access the equator in order so that the rubber bands don't kind of slip off from where they're being strapped. So he has one place to strap it right around the equator when that mold is set up straight. And it's not a great way. If he had a rectangular mold, a square mold, he would have had many different points to strap his mold together.
While working on it in the ceramic studio.
There's the sure form. Nice. High five.
They get into the clay.
With your sure form, you should spray it with WD-40 before you use it, because that plaster will rust them out fast.
Cause what we call line blowouts or explosions.
I don't know what that means. Oh, plaster in the clay.
Finally,
yeah.
Set the mold on the shelf.
Oh!
And leave it for...
Rookie move. The guy's doing great. He's made the video. This is where I go, how do I talk about improvements without sounding like I'm making a dick move on somebody's hard work? He cares enough to make a video for somebody, so I don't want to undo that. It's just that if you put a mold on the drying rack without a really highly compressed strap, that mold is going to dry unevenly and that mold will warp. You'll always have to dry your mold strapped together under tension. Otherwise you'll have big seam lines and gaps, or at least they're more likely.
3 to 4 days if it's just...
We used to just put a fan underneath the bottom, those wire racks.
1 to 2 days should be enough. Now that the molds are dry, we're ready to use the molds.
What is he doing?
First things first, we need to prepare our clay. When you pull it out of the bucket, it's going to have a lot of air bubbles and be uneven.
What is he doing? Is he going to use a press mold?
Stack it, pound it,
okay,
shape it, so that we can homogenize it and take away air.
Okay, I'm going to learn something.
See here, I'm doing a technique called ram's head wedging. It's I'm keeping the palm of my hands on the side and in front and pressing down small movements so not to stretch it out and fold it in on itself. That'll create air bubbles. But essentially, I'm doing this to homogenize the clay and make it even and empty of
But why?
air bubbles. Next, we need to make slabs. There's 3 techniques for making slabs.
I don't know what's going on, Kay.
The first technique, simply using your hands to
What's happening? That's my meme. What's happening?
To start to get a longer...
I don't know.
And then using the rolling pin.
He's got a plan. Let's see what his plan is.
Separate it from the plaster.
Yeah?
Then the second method, very similar to the first.
Okay, well, since we're talking slabs apparently, you have a piece of canvas and you put one piece of canvas on your workboard under the slab, and then you put your thickness regulator bars, I don't know what they're called, and then you put a piece of canvas on top of that, and then you slab roll that to get even thickness. But you're just going to slab roll this either onto a piece of plaster that you might crack because it's not very thick. It's just canvas. I use canvas always.
It uses now sticks on the side to make sure that
Also, people use rolling pins. They're effective, but they're not heavy. I used to take a big piece of PVC pipe and I put caps on it and I filled it with plaster. And that way the rolling pin was heavy on its own, like 10 or 11 pounds. And then I didn't have to use all this pressure to roll it out because the weight of the roller was heavy itself. So just because you have a rolling pin doesn't mean that you can't use something that's better or more ergonomic. So PVC pipe filled with plaster is a better rolling pin, in my opinion. But you have to have canvas or else the PVC sticks to the clay.
a very specific thickness of slab.
What is he doing?
Be sure to pull the clay away from the plaster before.
See, but if your plaster's not clean, you're just putting pieces of plaster into it. I don't get it.
And the third and final technique is really
Okay, I give up. Let me just get past what he's doing here.
smaller objects.
Oh my God, he's using it as a press mold.
Adding a coil here to create.
All right, so this is teachers teaching. What he's focused on is showing a technique and trying to figure out as many good things to teach as possible. I think the whole purpose of having a slip casting mold is to slip cast, which catches the detail very easily, because now if he's using this as a press mold, he has all that detail of the lens, and it just doesn't seem an effective use of time. If you're going through the trouble to make a mold, it's supposed to save you time in your production. This seems like a really committed old school way of doing it. He had to process the clay, now he's got to jack it into the mold, then he's got to clean up the seam line. I don't see the win here. For teaching, yes, but not for production.
Structure in the sharp corner of the light bulb in the bottom of the mold.
If you had to make 100 of these, are you kidding me?
Then you can use a number of wood tools to cut the excess clay away. Be sure to use wood because again, we want to avoid any chips of plaster getting into the clay. Metal tools definitely create those. Notice how I'm pulling the clay away from the opening.
Yes, 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 yes.
Pulling to create a larger surface area.
Looks like a lot of work, doesn't it, Kay? For a freaking light bulb.
But also, I'm slightly pressing that.
This is also why I would say make a mold of something that matters to you, because
I put the second mold on top.
If this weren't just a teaching demo, I would say this is really a slow way to do anything here.
And
it's a good thing ceramicists love what they do, right? Because it takes an hour, so what? You're still in the clay studio. Oh, this is killing me. Here's the thing. As a mold maker, I was selling my time. The faster I was at something, the more that the job, let's say I bid $100 on something, and if I could do it in 30 minutes, it was a big win. But if it took 4 hours, 5 hours, I wasn't winning. If it was my own art project, I'm not on the clock, but I was taught to be on the clock. Although that wasn't emotionally healthy for about 30 years, it's just how it was. So movements matter to me. Like a chef, don't waste your moves.
Found in the studio. You can use one of the secondary containers found in the wood shop to create some slip.
This is specific to his students because he's describing their. The thing is you get some Yahoo kid that throws in plaster into the slip, and then it's a total waste.
Directly from the bucket.
Yeah.
You won't.
I gotta get out of this.
On how wet your mold is and how much slip.
You can pull them apart, and then the light comes apart.
It might not come apart. That means it's too wet or too much slip. It should come apart fairly easily. Once you open it,
it's going to be a real heavy light bulb. It's got to be like 2 pounds of clay.
Pull it out too fast, you could hurt it or alter it. Gently rock it back.
No. I mean, he's doing everything right for his system, but it's just there's such another way to do it. And it doesn't mean the way I'm doing it is the right way. Remember, he works his way, I would work my way, and to me, that's a shit casting. I mean, it's got a lot of mistakes. Unless he wanted the effect, it's terrible.
You can absolutely keep those. You can also hide them by simply trimming them off.
I don't see the lens detail.
Before you start press molding again, it does help to go back and clean the mold.
Everything is twice as long.
Scrape away any excess.
All right, we're almost done. I got a lot to say. I'm ready. I gotta go home. I've been here too long. All right. Kay's saying off camera, he goes, I don't get it. This guy started with one layout. He had a round mold. He put in the keys. Then he went to another light bulb mold. Then he went to a square one, which said to me that he wasn't possibly quite fluid or fluent in what he wanted to do with this, or something changed. Maybe there's weeks in between, he got busy, summer happened, because it looks like the shelves are empty. and chairs are up. So that's a ceramics department that's not in use. That's a summer ceramics department. What do I say about this? You know, I like people that are teaching mold making of any kind. I like that they're showing processes, and I think that each person watching is not saying, oh, I want to make a mold of a light bulb, that's why I'm watching this video. They're looking to take pieces and parts out. I read every mold making book that I could find from the beginning of after World War I when they were doing prosthetics. I found these old moulage mold books. I considered a mold book successful to me if I picked up one or two new ideas. I knew how to make molds, that wasn't the point. I just needed a trick. And so maybe somebody watching this got a trick from this guy that they'll be like, oh, it's not a light bulb that I need, but my giraffe, this makes great sense. Overall, mold making should be very efficient at a certain point, especially if you're teaching it. I think that when you're teaching mold making, people are listening at a different depth, and they expect you to be teaching the best possible way, not a way that's like, oh, this is kind of the way to do it. I think that that's not a place for teaching video, that someone at the beginning should say, I haven't made this light bulb mold before, let's try it, it should be interesting. And sometimes, actually, the mistakes are more teachable moments than the finished piece. And so you'll see when I'm behind us here making molds, sometimes I'll let things go slightly wrong by design. It's not an excuse. Believe me, I've made thousands of molds. So it's not likely that I'll mess up unless I'm low on caffeine, but there are strategic reasons. If I were teaching and I say, do it this way, do it this way, do it this way, and somebody watches and go, yeah. But if they see a mistake, they remember it. So I learned quick to teach with mistakes as well. I don't think that was this guy's intention. I think he's a nice guy. I don't want to bash people, but as far as the mold making process, I'm going to give this a low 4. But just because it was way too much work for what he was doing. So that's what I have today. Stay tuned for our Hand-ufacturing platform. And remember, per my invitation, if you have mold making videos that you think are exceptional or otherwise, send the link to us and we'll look at doing a critique on them, because you never know what someone else is going to find valuable. I would love to learn from some videos as well. So thanks for watching. Thank you for watching this video. We're getting ready to launch a new platform called Hand-ufacturing. It's going to feature a lot more educational films about mold making and casting, from very basic to advanced mold making. Our hope is that it helps the business entrepreneurs out there learn efficient ways to manufacture their products and bring a lot more wealth into their household. Stay tuned.